So there is a case that has been reported from London that no doubt will open up a lot of debate, and it brings back memories of another case in this country in Norfolk in 1999. So a 78-year-old man, a 78-year-old pensioner by the name of Richard Osborn-Brooks, has been arrested on suspicion of murder after a burglar died of his injuries after an altercation at the address in Hither Green, southeast London, excuse me. The burglar was stabbed in his upper body and died of wounds in hospital, and his next have kind of been informed. And apparently, he was accompanied by another burglar. There's no question about this. They were burgling the house, so that's not a smear. That's what they were doing. Um, this sort of issue opens up a lot of moral questions, and I want to just share my thoughts on this. My street's relatively safe, but we've had our fair share of crime here. Not long ago, there was no fewer than 3 vehicles set on fire. It's quite shocking. Luckily, no one was injured, but still, it can happen anywhere. And I live in a relatively safe area. The Tony Martin case, that is a farmer who was jailed in 1999, in a sense was a template of cases. There have been others. And according to the Times, this is listing some of those cases. Earl Hansen, 51, was cleared in December, I assume that's December last year, of the murder of a drunk burglar at his home in Catford, southeast London. Mr. Hansen said he was acting in self-defence when he stabbed Mohammed Savare 50 times. Richie Gallagher, or Ricky Gallagher, 46, died in 2015 after an altercation in the home of Richard Glanville, a former executive at Aurora Fashions, who owns the Oasis Coast and Warehouse chains. Mr. Glanville and his gardener were arrested but did not face charges due to lack of evidence. In this case, the man's been retired for 15 years. He's 78 years old, and the neighbours have rallied around to defend him. Paramedics arrived. Neighbours did report what they saw. They assumed the man was drunk when he staggered out into the road, and he died of his injuries. He wasn't unarmed. He apparently had a screwdriver. Now, that whether that was to be used as a weapon or whether it was to break into the house, I don't know. But apparently burglary is a big problem in this area, Hither Green, southeast London. I don't know what's happened with the other guy, whether he ran away or I don't know. I consider myself conservative on crime, and I absolutely defend the right of homeowners to defend themselves. And people need to remember that when someone crosses your threshold, when someone breaks into your house, you don't know if they're just wanting to steal something or whether it's going to be an aggressive home invasion. You just don't know. I do take the view that when someone crosses your threshold, that's it. I mean, there's the old expression, an Englishman's home is his castle. Let's expand that. A Briton's home is their castle. And that's a very solid principle. If someone makes a conscientious decision to cross that line into your private space, into your place of sanctuary, then really it's difficult to argue that they have many rights at all. As it stands, the law does allow, and this is something I believe the Conservatives brought in, the law allows homeowners to use reasonable force. Now, this is defined as using a weapon. So some American viewers might say, oh, you Brits are, when it comes to the gun debate, you Brits can't do anything. That's not technically true. Homeowners are allowed to defend themselves and we are allowed to use weapons. I actually have some blunt objects around this house. I'm not going to go into details, but someone comes into my house, I would not hesitate to use those things as weapons. I wouldn't intend to kill the person, but I would use reasonable force. I knock them out. I would do what I can to restrain them. Then I'd call the police. Now there is an area that gets a bit murky, and it has to be said. It goes without saying most of the public are going to support this man. They're going to say the burglar got what was coming to him. And there's going to be very, very few people crying over this guy. I certainly don't cry over him. But we do need to ask some questions. Should absolutely nothing happen? I don't know. Firstly, you need to see what evidence is available. A man is dead. He's a criminal. He was doing something that, he was violating someone else's private space. But a man is dead. And so you can't, in a civilized society, simply let that go. Um, I think that's important to point out. So, yes, it does have to be investigated, and it needs to be verified. Did this take place within the man's house? If it took place within his house, I would say he was absolutely justified. Now, if he killed the burglar outside his house, that gets into quite a grey area, i.e., if the burglar was running away. I don't know the full circumstances here, it's still being established. Um, so, the law actually does allow people to use reasonable force, but it prohibits a prolonged attack. So, for example, let's say a guy breaks into my house tonight and I knock that guy out and I decide to tie him up and pour boiling water over him and break his legs and pull his fingernails out, prolonged torture, then I would be arrested, and rightly so. I say that because reasonable force means doing what you can to protect yourself and your family. And I've no sympathy with burglars, being knocked out or getting their legs broken, something like that. But there is a clear line between self-defense and, for example, getting into gratuitous violence. Having said that, there is a survival instinct at play there. Now, if you have young children and someone breaks into your house, you don't know if that person's going to be a threat or not. If someone used profound violence in order to, stop that person, who would blame them when they are honestly concerned for, their children's safety or their family's safety? But if you live on your own and you torture the person, I think in a civilized society we have to say that's going beyond reasonable force. Now, in this case, I think most people will look at this and say this was an elderly man. Burglary is a problem in the area. He was presumably thinking of his wife as well. I think most people will support this man. Neighbours said he was a very friendly guy. There's no indication that he was an aggressive or violent individual. It sounds to me like someone acting out of an extremely stressful situation. People say he's a nice man, nice to talk to. He's an old man. It's a shame, really. I hope the law makes sense and lets him off. I don't think it's right. So the question is, should he be totally let off? The only problem with that is it might send out a message that it might encourage vigilantism. That's the only concern I would have with absolutely nothing happening. I don't think he should go to prison. And I think there's a very strong case that this was a man defending his property. He was acting out of stress. So I do think he should be cleared. But I think all the circumstances need to be looked at. For example, was the burglar using violence? That's a very important question. If he was, no sympathy at all. Now, if the burglar wasn't using violence, it gets a little bit more grey, although it still comes down to the point he crossed this man's threshold. As soon as you go into a stranger's house with the intention, whether you're going to use violence or not, you have crossed the threshold. And that has to be a fundamental issue, because if we don't insist on that, then you have anarchy. You have to have consequences for that sort of action. But by the same token, I do think that you can't really have a situation where it's sort of like if someone burgles your house and you could do whatever you want to them. That's, that can get into quite a grey area. Many people will say this guy is no loss, and maybe that's true. But a man is dead, and whatever way you look at it, that can't be taken lightly. It's not a trivial thing. So the way what I would summarize with this is, if it's ascertained that this burglar was killed within the house, then I think a reasonable case can be made that this man was protecting himself and his wife. He's an elderly man, and the man crossed his threshold, the men, I should say. That's a very scary thing for anyone, particularly in an area which apparently does have a problem with burglary. So I think in this case he should be cleared. However, there's other situations. That case of Errol Hansen, who was cleared, he stabbed the man 50 times. Now, that does seem excessive to me. Once, twice, three times maybe for self defense. 50 times does seem a bit gratuitous to me. So I think each case needs to be looked at on its own merit. I don't think you could just make a blanket generalization and say every case is the same. Each case needs to be looked at on its own merit. I think as the law stands, it's probably about right, i.e., homeowners are justified in using reasonable force. Although it does say charges can be brought against a homeowner if an attack is unnecessarily prolonged. I agree with that. But if traps are left for potential burglars, well, I don't agree with that. You know, what's wrong with leaving traps? If they burgle your house and they get their foot caught in a trap, tough. That's it's one thing if you like rig up a machine that shoots them as soon as they enter. That might be another question. But as for any of our American viewers maybe watching this, I would say you're absolutely in no position to be gloating and say, "Oh, you Brits, you get this. This is what you get for having for having strong gun laws." Well, I reassert the fact that Britain has very low gun homicide rates. We do have a knife problem. We have a serious knife problem in the capital. That's something I'll, if I get a chance, be talking about because it is definitely something that needs to be discussed. London this year has actually recorded more homicides, at least in the last 2 months, than New York City. So it's a very serious subject that needs to be raised. To conclude, I think looking at everything we know about this case, the man was acting in genuine self-defense. I hope he is cleared. There's no way he should go to prison for this. But we also need to be a little bit careful about not just saying that vigilantism is okay. I think someone's house is sacred. But if you say then, you have to be very careful that we are a society of law and order. And that means that we can't send out the message that vigilantism is okay. However, reasonable self-defense is. And I think this comes into that latter category. Let me know your thoughts. Incidentally, it won't surprise you to know that about the vast majority of the public are going to support this man, as do I. As do I. I just think we need to be a little wary. I mean, that case, for example, of the guy that stabbed the burglar 50 times, 50 seems excessive to me. I would say stab him enough to restrain him, then call the police. 50 sounds to me like you're intending to kill him. I don't know. There are real moral questions. Let me know your thoughts.